Okay, thanks for joining, and let's start with the learning outcome 3 today. So in this learning outcome, we are going to understand how technology can be used to manage data. This is one of the bits that we want to look at today, in this learning outcome. Now, so far, just a quick bit of recap that I want to do is what we've covered in terms of this particular unit. We have looked at learning outcome 1 and learning outcome 2. In learning outcome 1, what we've done is we've basically started with understanding the role of technology. So when I look at the role of technology, initially we discussed very briefly things like, how technology helps us in being more productive and more effective as a teacher. So some of the equipment, software, and obviously, um, let's say, usefulness of technology as an end user for a higher education user like a teacher is what we've discussed in the learning outcome 1. We also looked at a bit of discussion on what is the pedagogical approach with regards to technology as far as learning outcome 1 is concerned, and how it is related to self-managed learning or lifelong learning, and then how technology can be a facilitator as far as helping us to teach and deliver, create more engaging classrooms, inclusive teaching within the classroom or online that we teach. Teaching can happen everywhere, anywhere, and it could be whether you're a trainer, instructor, teacher, lecturer, a teaching assistant. There are bits and pieces that we do which are classed as teaching, and because you have learners, students, children who are learning from you, there is a lot of use of technology that we can do in the case of supporting the process of teaching and learning. Learning outcome 2 was the use of technology in education. So specifically, we looked at certain examples of how technology can come to our aid when we are essentially looking at, say, designing or classifying activities that we do in classrooms. So these activities could be, quizzes that you do, or group discussions that you do. Sometimes we look at these activities which are predominantly designed specifically for people with disability. So in such cases, technology can come to our aid, and the use of IT platforms like learner management system, Blackboard, sometimes use of social media and other creative learning environments and equipment was something that we discussed in terms of learning outcome 2. Now, learning outcome 2 also essentially helped us understand and differentiate the use of technology in various aspects. So what I would do is I would look at classifying them as technology, but within technology, you have software, hardware, you have end customer or end user applications of this software. Say, for example, when we do look at surveys, we look at feedback, collecting feedback. When we look at use of IT specifically for the purposes of documenting, let's say, evidence like assignments, checking plagiarism. So those are the bits that we looked at in learning outcome 2. Now, with technology becoming such an integral part of in education, what we also want to be looking at on the flip side is that how do we manage this data, which is basically going to remain as a record because of technology. As you know, the technology is being used to store data, retrieve data. So what we also want to be able to do is at some stage look at how do we manage this data as far as with the use of technology is concerned. When I say manage the data, there could be things like a simple example that I would give you is that in a college like ours, when learners submit assignments, we are able to generate a report for plagiarism or similarity. Now, how do we store this report? What is the usage of this report? Who has access to this report? And how is this report useful in linking the evaluation of the student to the achievement that the student is trying to do needs to be looked at when we look at how do we manage data in technology. So one of the outputs that is coming out of the use of technology in higher education or further education, primary, secondary education, is that there is data which comes out as reports, as further information, and that needs to be managed and stored in a way that is safe, that is retrievable. It does not fall into the wrong hands. And when we look at privacy issues related to Journal Data Protection Act, we need to ensure that this data, which is being produced as an output because of the use of technology or because of the use of processing of data with the help of technology, is secure and it is safe from a point of view of usage and retrieval. So there are two assessment criteria in this learning outcome, which talk about 3.1, which is explain data generated during teaching and learning. So let's look at some of the outputs of what it generates as a data, and we'll go into details. And then we look at the second assessment criteria, which talks about explain how do you use technology to manage data. So they are very similar, but in the first instance, what we need to understand is how data is generated. And in the second instance, what we need to do is understand this generated data, which is generated because we have used technology or used some synthesis, some processing, scanning of it. How do we then manage it and access it for the purposes of various people within the organization? So let's look at discussing this with the help of a bit of a presentation. I've got a few slides that I have created, and that is what we will be using for the purposes of our discussion of this learning outcome. So in the learning outcome, the indicative content which is given is, it talks about data being used for performance monitoring and review, for developing value through sharing of resources. Sometimes, one of the reasons why we use technology is that it creates a print wherein this data can be stored and can be retrieved for future usages. So unlike paper, wherein you archive it, although it can still be retrieved and used, but the ease with which the data can be retrieved and used in the case of, technology, when we electronically store documents, is something which is going to be quite useful for teachers. Because if I create a scheme of work or a lesson plan, or if I create this presentation and when I have new learners joining it, I can update these slides very quickly, and I can use these slides to be able to discuss and teach and deliver this program again, or this unit again, to a different number of learners. But if it was done in a classroom-based setting, it might be slightly difficult or slightly repetitive, because what I would do is, if I've created activities or if I've created documentation which was given to the students, and at some stage this documentation was then done away with in terms of archive, or thrown away because it served its purpose, like a group discussion activity, I would have given some handouts, but after that the handouts would have been used by the learners and they would have taken it away to their home for their personal use. Then I have to restart and redo this discussion with a new set of learners. Then it might become a bit difficult because I'll have to produce these handouts again. So even with the use of technology, I can create them electronically, print them out, store it on my hard drive. And that is where the use of technology in developing value through sharing of resources comes in. So if I have a new teacher who's joined and is a teacher in my team, I can provide the copy of these presentations to them to be able to teach and deliver. So integration of processes and procedures, exchange of personal skills, knowledge, and also, resources, because resources, when we look at, is time, cost, quality angle. So when we look at measuring them against time, cost, and quality that you spend in terms of time to create those resources, and then the quality that you create those resources with, and then specifically the time that you spend, which can be related to some sort of cost, is important. And we will also look at digitizing documents, which is something which is quite important. So when we do look at the aspect of storing documents, we have to digitize them, archive them, label them, number them. And then obviously, if there is a lot of documentation being stored, there should be a proper system to be able to retrieve it. And that is where the ISO system comes in, when we talk about the ISO 27001 data management system, which sometimes universities and a large number of training providers employ, because it allows them to securely save data, retrieve data, set access rights of who can access what data, and that helps in improving security. And then in last, we will also look at, Journal Data Protection Regulation, which is under the Data Protection Act, which was revised in 2016 when GDPR was introduced. So those are the bits that we are looking at covering in today's learning outcome. So just a brief summary of that, which we looked at. Now, let's go into a bit of detail. So any questions, feel free to ask me as we go along. Now, one of the overarching things that we do always in our discussions is to understand how does technology, use the use of technology. If you and me, we look at end users as teachers or as tutors, how do we use technology to be able to manage data? So a couple of things which come to our mind when we look at managing data and the use of technologies. First of all, if you visualize, even before you start looking at technology, first and foremost thing that you have to do is collect data. That means you have to find out what all you are looking at using, and you need to be able to have those resources with you. So in our case, what we end up doing is we go to Google, for example, we look at searching certain resources. It could be articles, journals, it could be presentations. We look at also collecting books. We look at, say, for example, presentations, and they are collected because what you would want to do is create a repository from where you would actually start filtering it down to relate it to the course content that you are teaching. So in general, technology facilitates us in the collection of data, large volumes of data. If I go back 25 years, when there was no internet or very limited form of the internet, most of the data was stored on paper. And in order to retrieve, you had to go to libraries, archives, and open them up and then make notes from those archives to be able to use them in class, as my teachers used to do. But today, all of this is available on the internet. It has been digitized. It is something which is available in the electronic format. And there are different systems through which this data can be collected. So learner management system is one from which you are using. Then there is things like online surveys and forms. There is assessment tools like quizzes, and all these kind of different forms of, let's say, use of technology allows you to collect data. Now, when you collected data, what you have to do, you want to look at storing data so that you are able to store it in an archive, in a numbering system, in some sort of a structured system which allows you to even retrieve it at a later stage. The storage of the data has to be done in such a way that it allows you to retrieve it, and a number of different types of users can open it on different machines. So we look at Microsoft, and we look at, for example, Mac, which are devices on which you can open the data. But apart from that, you have devices like Google Drive, OneDrive, Dropbox, Boxbee, and a couple of other cloud-based solutions which allow you to store data today. So Microsoft SharePoint, which is now used in schools and is a tool, collaborative tool, which allows teachers to store data and save data and also share data with other teachers, is one such way wherein you can look at that data needs to be stored and organized. Now, storage of data can be done in different ways. If I look at this particular course, we have 6 units. We have a course handbook, some of the material which is required for enrollment for the course, books like course handbooks, assignment briefs, front cover sheets, marking sheets. That is one form of data. Second form of data is presentations. Third form of data is articles, journals, case studies, and handouts. And the last form of data could be data which the student produces and sends it into us as evidence for assignments. And all such form of data is stored within the server in the college. Then next logical sequence is you look at data analysis. So if you have got a lot of data, what is that data of any use to you? You have to look at further processing it, and further processing it means that you're synthesizing that data into meaningful reports. And this can be done in different formats. So when you look at data analysis could be done through softwares like, if I look at economic data, just as an example, you look at stock exchange data, they are producing, if you look at trading of stocks, it is producing lots and lots of data. But obviously, share brokers as customers, what you're looking at is softwares which are able to crunch that data into some sort of meaningful report. So if you want to look at the share of Apple or Google and how it has done in the last 3 months, you would look at some sort of data analysis tool. And that data analysis tool would allow you to understand the trends in terms of how the stock has been faring in the stock market over the last few weeks and months. Similarly, when we look at data analysis in education, what you're looking at is lots of surveys, feedbacks, exit interviews are being collected over the point in time within a college, in an educational institution. This data is then analyzed over a point in time to look at trends. And that could be one such way of finding out whether the usage experience or the student experience is improving, whether the student achievement rates are increasing, whether the students' grades are improving. Those kind of things would be all done through data analytics. And at some stage, once the data has been created into reports, what you then tend to do is look at sharing that data with management. Sometimes you have different types of users and stakeholders. So in schools, if you look at the stakeholders, could be parents, it could be course leaders, it could be teachers, it could be teaching assistants, it could be administration, it could be IT, and it could be in general, tutors which are teaching the students in the classrooms. And each of them would require different form of data that they would need to be able to make use of it for the purposes of understanding how their teaching is happening, or is there a pattern to teaching, and is there progress being made, things like that. So parents would get reports in the form of parent-teacher portals, which is when they get reports of their children in terms of cash reports like knowledge, attitude, skills, and behaviors. You might look at these reports going out to off-call. They might be going to Ofsted. And in some cases, if the school is a part of a larger consortium, that means it has a number of schools, it might be going centralized to the head office to management. Then you look at data security and privacy. Because data is generated, it needs to be reliably managed, and data could be sensitive data, which could have information about students, staff involved, their dates of birth, and it could lead, if it is going to fall into wrong hands, then it can lead to issues or problems. It can be misused. So in such cases, when data is stored using technology, the data could be encrypted. There could be access controls which could be provided, and they are called what is called role-based access roles. So you have quality managers, you have tutors, you have assessors, you have external examiners, you have the board, and they all will have different access rights to be able to get access to that data. And this is done in compliance with regulations like GDPR, which has to be followed, wherein the data that is to be stored is governed by the data protection officer or somebody who's responsible to ensure that the data does not fall into wrong hands. And when personal data is collected, it is stored and retrieved in a format wherein roles are clearly defined, and people with access roles are only allowed to access that data. And they would need, in some cases, prior permissions before this data is even shared. Now, this gives you a good understanding of why we need to look at managing data with technology. And so in some cases, when we look at data reporting, a lot of us today, when we go into offices or when we go into our educational setup, schools, we have our dashboard, we have a CRM system, or we have some sort of system which gives us access to the data. And in such cases, you would generally see that the CRM or the system which the school or the university or the college is using will have access rights to it. And these access rights would only allow you to generate reports. So if reporting as a function is taken away from your dashboard, then you're able to see the data, but you're not able to compile them into further reports or crunch them into further reports, because that would again require access, from your manager or relevant person. And that is why data needs to be managed using, because of technology, it makes it easily accessible. You might get the username and a password of a machine. You're able to log into a PC. You're able to see the marks and grades for a particular cohort or a particular teacher or a tutor. And that might be you infringing on somebody's data because you should not have access to it, but because you've got the username and password, and that allows you to access it, which would be considered wrong or a wrong practice. And in such cases, that will comprise of what is called breach of data. And in such cases, data needs to be securely managed and obviously, retrieved on the basis of user-based access rules, which allow different people to access data on the basis of their title or role in the organization. And that is what you need to understand when we talk about this particular learning outcome. Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's great. Now, let's look at going into some of the assessment criteria and go into detailing of what it is asking us to do. The first assessment criteria talks about explaining data generated during teaching and learning. So when we talk about, we know in general, we've discussed about data and what data can be used. But what we want to now do in the assessment criteria is look at data which is specifically, for the purposes of how do we use it in a teaching setup, a school, a college, a university. Now, there are lots of different types of data which can be generated during teaching and learning. Now, when we talk about this type of generation of data, this data might be referred to as what is called educational data, because this educational data is data related to the performance or how the students or learners are performing in terms of their courses or qualifications that they are doing. It might also consist of things like, capturing data in terms of their behavior and outcomes, and in some cases, how the teaching and delivery is happening in the classroom. So when I talk about this type of data would be, for example, teaching observations. So if I'm the manager and I manage about 20 teachers, then one of the roles that I do in my role is to also look at doing observation of teaching for different courses. And in such cases, when I do the observation of teaching, I'm noting down or observing my fellow colleagues who are giving and doing lectures, and how are they doing in delivering lectures. Are these lectures interactive? Are they engaging? Are they providing sufficient knowledge to learners? Is there enough knowledge with the lecturer who's delivering this lecture, or the data which is being shared with the learners on the lecture? Now, all such things that I look at is a part and parcel of what is called teaching observation. Now, when I've done the teaching observation, what could be the data which comes out of it? The data which comes out of teaching observations could be things like understanding the personal behavior and the interaction between the tutor or the lecturer and the students. That is one form of data which is coming out. I might be able to see how the lecturer is able to manage the classroom and manage behaviors within the classroom. I might also be able to see from that teaching report what are the strengths and weakness areas of the lecturer in terms of teaching and delivery. I might also be able to come out with other forms of inferences when I've done the teaching observation to check on the knowledge, skills, and the attitude in terms of how the lecturer is actually delivering in the class. Now, some part of this data could be sensitive data, which cannot be shared with other lecturers or with students, because this is a personal observation which needs to be shared with the lecturer for the purposes of their personal and professional development. Now, in such cases, when we look at just one aspect of educational data, teaching observations give that data. Another example that you can think of would be when we talk about, say, for example, if the students were given a test and the test papers were then tallied and marked, and the results of that test which have come out is another form of data, which is something which reflects students' performance. We could look at doing or carrying out activities in the class. Sometimes in schools, you would generally see that they take the students out on an educational tour or in some sort of, educational trip, to let them gain and get experience of a particular environment, culture. And in such cases, the teachers would note down the behavioral data of the student in terms of how does the student behave independently in an environment which is outside the class. Are they able to follow instructions? Are they able to take instructions and interpret them, and then execute the desired outcomes which are expected from them? Do they misbehave? Do they show rash behavior? In such cases, that form of data which comes out when students are taken across on an educational trip, or say, for example, an outside trip, would also give us some data. And that would be helpful for me as a teacher, is to keep in mind that in future, if we have to get, if we get a participation opportunity like in the BBC, or for example, if we get an opportunity when the school is invited to go and witness, say for example, a play in a theater, then in such cases, teachers sometimes end up drawing up the names of the students which they think would show a good behavior, and this is something that they'll be able to manage in such an environment when they carry out that activity. And that form of data which comes out would be a form of educational data. Is that okay? So when we do talk about different forms of data, what I've done is I've created certain slides to highlight that form of data. So one such format of data is performance data, which could be coming out of test results, assignment grades, and obviously course completion rates. Now, what is this going to be used for? If this data we have to look at student performance data, what this would be useful for? Any ideas? Data which is going to be useful, which is coming out of test scores, assignment grades, completion rates. What do you think this data will be useful for? Any ideas? So test scores, for example.
This data is very helpful for the overall performance of the student. We can check the whole year performance of the student, behavior, uh, uh, his behavior, how much his behavior in study and in overall the relationship with students and colleagues. So in this way, we can manage the data of the students, and overall we can assess the overall performance of the student.
Correct. So this is one such way wherein if we know that we put a student to test, what you rightly said, and the test results come out good, then we know that the student is performing well, they are able to understand the subject matter, and they are doing well in the class. And that would be useful for the teachers because it will give them a very clear idea in terms of how their teaching and learning is actually faring in the class. And that would be useful for the students. So and also for the teachers. And that data could be also used to monitor the academic achievements and progression rate of students when they look at further activities. So if you complete this course, after that you want to do another course, then if you've completed with good marks and good grades, it allows teachers to confidently progress you to the next level of the course. And that is going to be useful as far as performance data is concerned. Then we look at engagement data. You generally see in schools that, schools normally give out attendance medal records at the end of the year that the student has got 95% and above attendance. They look at when we look at the cash reports, which are reports which are basically for knowledge, attitude, skills, and habit. The cash reports typically, when we look at attitude and habits, we look at that because in the classroom, teachers relate that to the participation in the class. How many times the student asks the question? Are they able to answer the question? Do they participate in discussions? And those kind of data is useful because students, then teachers at some stage, look at giving predictive grades. It's because they understand that the student engages, interacts with other learners, and is able to understand the sessions and is responsive to the questions which are raised. That allows the teachers to also, to a certain extent, reflect on predictive grades and insights into how the student will actually be motivated to achieve the course or achieve the aims and objectives of the lesson. And in such cases, engagement data is very useful because when Ofsted does teaching observations and visit schools or institutions for the purposes of inspections, they want to see how much engagement does the teacher have with the student. How does the teacher look at increasing engagement with the students? What kind of activities you carry out in the class which allow you to increase engagement with the students? Are you able to take the weakest link along with you in the class? Those kind of things are important because it tells and it gives the inspector confidence that the teachers are knowledgeable, they understand how to interact, they understand behaviors, they are doing their bit to understand the background and culture of the students, which allows them to interact more so with regards to the students and essentially allowing them to achieve the outcomes which they are expected to do. So student engagement data is important. Then you look at behavioral data, which I give an example of an excursion trip or a educational trip, which the school or university, sometimes when you have student exchange programs, and in such cases, they will look at things like incidents of misconduct, violation of rules, any sort of disciplinary problems the student or children have created, and have they shown good behavior in terms of mannerism, professionalism, and understanding instructions. Those could be related to behavioral data. And that is useful because teachers, next time when they draw the list of students for activities and things like that, it looks at providing them some sort of a background in terms of whether the student is passionate, motivated, extrovert, introvert, and that kind of behavioral data helps them to predict the overall development or the outcomes for the student. Then you look at learning processing data, which is basically data which is based on the tasks which are set for students. And are they able to complete those tasks? Are they engaging in those tasks on a regular basis? Most schools today have homeworks which are given on, what are called electronic forums or boards or websites. And what the school is looking at doing is asking the children to practice using those platforms. And in such cases, what they're looking at is, habits essentially for students or children in this case to ensure that they are able to practice and follow those instructions to be able to do exercises which makes them better in understanding the teaching and learning material. So I won't go into details of everything, but there are different forms of data that I've taken up here. Assessment data would be more from point of view of colleges and higher education institution, wherein it is coming out of formative oblique summative feedback, which is like assignments or diagnostic data, which is initial assessments. And that also allows teachers to keep a track of the progress of students in terms of how they are faring in the qualification. Feedback data refers to surveys or exit interviews, course surveys, or reviews which the institution gets. And the idea here is that the management looks at this data in order to ensure that they can improve performance, improve the Ofsted rating, off-call rating, Ofsted rating essentially of their school and institution. And in such cases, feedback which is coming in from learners, from parents, from any other stakeholder involved in the delivery of teaching and learning, this data is going to be useful for the purposes of reflection and improvement further of delivery of teaching and learning, within classrooms, or if as an educational setup, you're delivering regulated qualifications, then it allows the institution to look at completion rates. What are the completion rates? How far are the students at, joining the course and completing and achieving the outcomes which are required? And in such cases, you would look at the feedback data. You have lots of administrative data which comes out, and this administrative data could be sometimes referred to as what is called self-evaluation reports. Now, because there are different forms of data which is coming out, things like feedback, things like performance data, assessment data, learning data, behavioral data, at some stage, the management of the organization could be looking at an overall report, which basically gives them some sort of a overarching understanding of how the students and the educational institution is doing. In such cases, when you put pre-admissions, post-admissions, and teaching and learning data into the aspect of creating reports, then in such cases, that data could be classified as what is called operational data or administrative data. And that could be looking at staff turnover, it could be looking at enrollments, it could be looking at dropouts, it could be looking at achievement rates, it could be looking at feedback that they get as an institution in terms of ranking overall within a particular setup or a market, and that would be classed as what is called administrative data. So as you would see that there are different, and this administrative data would be used by management for decision making at the institutional level. So things like changing of policies, introduction of more staff, allocation of more staff in certain places wherein this institution might not be doing well, and in general for policy development and following the compliance and regulations which are set by various bodies. And these bodies could be off-call, Ofsted, Department for Education, and in some cases, you would look at external bodies which are used to benchmark this data. And in such cases, the monitoring of such data, crunching of reports, and utilization of that data, which is operational data coming out from the institution, which could be a combination of all different forms of data, could be used for the purposes of monitoring, review, and decision making. Is that okay? Any questions on this?
Yes, sir. No question.
Okay. Now, the other assessment criteria, that we are looking at is primarily going into details of how do we use technology to manage learner data. Now, this is where compliance, regulation, and privacy and storage and retrieval of data comes in. This is important because of the fact that when we use and store data, which is in the form of records on any sort of a system, whether it's cloud-based system, whether it's in the college, whether it's within the premises, what we are looking at is the same process through which you would manage the data. So when the data is collected and the data is stored, data is retrieved, what we want to be able to look at is how do we then, ensure that the data that has been collected, analyzed, retrieved, stored, is then essentially, secure from a point of view of access. And are there any access rights in terms of data? So here is where we would look at focusing on managing learner data, whether it's in the form of assignment records, whether it's in the form of plagiarism reports, whether it's in the form of certifications, grades, individual learning plans, any sort of data which has been shared with the parents or legal guardians in the case of school through parent-teacher reports. That data needs to be managed using technology so that there are access rights to those data. And in such cases, data security and privacy becomes very important. So when we look at such reports, if it is not for the current year, then these reports are archived. That means they are stored, archived onto an electronic system or a server. And that would mean people will only get access to it if they have access rights. And in such cases, we define what are called access controls, role-based access controls, which allow, say, for example, there is a compliance manager within the institution, and then compliance manager would basically be looking at defining these access controls to ensure who has access to what form of data. Now, one such data in schools that you look at is, if I look at different forms of data, one such form of data is personal data, which could be data related to, say, identity, say, for example, background, your culture, religion. It could be to do with, demographic data about your parents, your income level, and things like that. Now, this data, which is collected at the time of admissions, can only be accessed by admissions manager or somebody who's looking at pre-qualifying the student or the children taking admission into that particular school. And in such cases, personal data will only be available to, I would say, the admission manager or management within the organization. Then you have what is called operational data, which is data coming out of reports or performance of students, and this data could be results or certification. Now, this data would be accessible by teachers, by students, and anybody who's, say, for example, sending a request for confirmation whether the student has studied in this particular school or college, and when did they start, when did they study, and when did they complete that qualification. That is something which is going to be accessible by maybe employers or somebody who's seeking a verification. But what they will need to do is, when they get hold of certification or confirmation of this certification, it would need them to provide what is called a GDPR form. And access to student grades would be some part of that operational data that you would need to look at. And in such cases, the compliance manager or the data protection manager or DPO, data protection officer, essentially would define the access and allow the access to such data for an employer. And the reason, I'll give you an example here. If you had completed this course and you apply to a job in a school, and the school wants to verify the diploma that you achieved. So in such cases, the school will essentially write to your provider to say, could you verify and confirm whether the student has studied with you in the college and whether the student has achieved this qualification. Now, in such cases, what they will do is before they send this request to us as an employer or as a prospective employer, they will provide a GDPR form, and that GDPR form will get a consent from you to say, yes, I give consent for the college, for my employer to be able to take a consent and confirm this qualification with my college. And you would sign that form. They would send us a copy of that form along with the questions or their queries, which they want a confirmation of. When did you start this course? When did the course finish? How was the, when was the certification done? And is the certification, genuine or not? And in such cases, that would be defined by access control. So here, when we receive that request, a registrar would be, or an examination officer would receive that request. He or she would be essentially looking at that GDPR form and then responding back to your employer to confirm, because all the details have been provided. She or he would confirm whether the qualification is genuine and the start and end dates and other data that they've asked for. And that will be basis the access controls, because these access controls are required as a matter of compliance under the Data Protection Act in the UK and in Europe, and that is called GDPR. So that would be something which would be done using technology. So the access rights to the registrar would allow her to go into, say, a system which they are using. She would have access rights to go into the folders, look at the pre-admission data, look at the proof of identity, look at date of birth and all that stuff, and then also see a copy of the certificate. And then she would confirm that, to the employer to say that, yes, this is all genuine, and thank you for, I can confirm that this is all genuine, and thank you for your inquiry. Now, that would be the use of technology to manage learners' data. It is not anybody or somebody who can do this in the organization. It will be just the designated or the nominated person who would be able to do that as far as, the managing of data is concerned. Now, There could be lots of other reasons why data could be required and would need to be retrieved. But here, the access-based controls would ensure that data is only available to people who have the right to access it, who would need it to be able to comply or provide confirmations with. And that would be the role which technology would play in electronically shelving, or say, for example, electronically giving access rights to users in whichever system the college uses or the school uses. So sometimes schools use what is a system called Pro Monitor. In colleges, that system could be a learner management system. In large institutions, it could be Blackboard. In universities, it could be a Blackboard plus a CRM. In our case, at our college, we use a CRM, and that CRM system has access given to different types of users and what they can use and access in terms of accessing that data. I'll give you a simple example by showing you that system, just to put this into perspective. So here, as you would see, that if I look at going into the management of the administration of users who have access to the data, I can see that they have access to different forms of systems on in our college. And in some cases, when I go and edit, for example, they would have different rights in terms of what they are able to do. And these rights would essentially ensure that they are able to make changes, delete data, or add data, and that would be a similar part. That would be, something which most organizations would have when they look at using technology to be able to manage data or give access to data, to users within the educational setup or any such institution. Is that okay? Good stuff. So that brings us to the end of this particular learning outcome. And I hope you've understood, because there were only 2 assessment criteria. So if there are any questions, please feel free to ask me now. Any questions on this learning outcome?
Okay.
Good stuff. So I will get the copy of this recording onto Moodle shortly. And what we'll do is we'll catch up tomorrow in covering learning outcome 4. Learning outcome 4 is a bit of a practical learning outcome because it talks about be able to. That means whatever we have learned so far in terms of, this particular unit, we'll be looking at putting it into practice by, obviously carrying out a bit of practical aspect of research. And that would mean to look at a topic, look at, how different resources can be collected for that particular topic, and then how do you put that into a bit of an output with regards to a report. And that is what we will be looking at in terms of being able to plan and carry out research using technology. So this might not be directly related to what we've covered in the learning outcomes and in the unit, but as the awarding bodies put it, this is more or less like a little bit of a mini research project, which is to look at your capability of the teacher, as a tutor, as a lecturer, as an instructor, to say that how you can use technology to be able to, do a bit of research, put something together, and then teach and deliver in the classroom. And that is what we need to put together for this particular learning outcome. And we'll discuss, and I'll show you a couple of things tomorrow to be able to cover this learning outcome. So until then, obviously, thanks for joining today, and I'll see you tomorrow at the same time.